Hi everyone, we are back again with the next installment from our exciting and interesting book, at least that's what I think, the exciting book Chickadee by Louise Erdrich. Let's get started right away. We left off with the family of Chickadee in hot pursuit of him as he had been kidnapped by two nasty brothers. Now they are trapped in a snowstorm and Chickadee is learning how to be a slave, or at least a servant. So let's start chapter 10, Two Strikes, Knives. The snow had lightly dusted the cabin of Babiche and Baptiste before gathering force and moving eastward to bury Chickadee's family. Exhausted from his second day as a servant, his stomach aching from another day of booyah, Chickadee fell asleep. He slept so hard that he didn't hear the mail carrier arrive from St. Paul. The man, Orph Carter, had ridden through the storm, knowing that to stop was death. His horse had gone this route before and was now munching from a pile of dried slough grass in the shanty with the two brown horses. Orph crawled into the cabin with the mail sacks and unrolled his blankets. Soon, his snores joined forces with the roaring rapids of snores from the brothers. All that sleep noise became a mighty cataract. Chickadee slept right through it. At first light, while the men were still sleeping, Chickadee crept out of his covers and noticed that there was another lump of blankets in the cabin. He kindled the fire from the banked ashes and added buffalo chips. Because there was another lump on the floor which he assumed was a person, Chickadee added an extra big chunk of moldy old meat to the kettle and slipped out for an extra dollop of snow. As the booyah slowly warmed, he stirred in the flour. There were also plenty of mice droppings from the night before. No matter how tightly Chickadee put the lid on the kettle, mice somehow got into the stew pot. He was already used to the musty taste. As the stew heated up, the cabin air filled with the unsavory steam so beloved by the Gigog brothers.
"Ah," said Babiche, stirring and yawning, "how good it is to have a servant." "Aye," said Baptiste, "he creates a good booyah, this boy. He makes booyah like our mother used to make."
The brothers paused and made the sign of the cross and kissed their lips.
"Mon Dieu," they cried, "this boy was well worth stealing."
Stealing? Orph Carter had awakened. You stole him?
"Har, har," said Babiche, "we stole this boy from the family of Miquam Ice and the hunter Anamikins, whose wife is Omachaias and whose brother is Quill. She has a sister, Angeline, whose husband is Fishtail. They have a grandmother with them, and they sometimes travel with a strange woman called Two Strike."
Two Strike? Orph Carter jumped out of his blankets.
"Have some booyah,"
said Baptiste, spooning a glop of the stuff onto a slab of wood and passing it to Orph. Are you fellows crazy?
"You would be the crazy one," said Babiche, "if you passed up this delicious stew."
Orph pushed away the plank. I'd rather eat boiled mice, he said.
"All right," said Baptiste, bending over the stew pot. "I'll dig around and see if I can get some for you."
Two Strike? You have stolen some boy from Two Strike? She'll gut you like a fish when she finds out.
"Har,"
said Babiche. She will lay in wait for you with two knives between her teeth, two knives in her hands, a knife in her hat, knives in her socks. For all I know, that woman carries a knife in her breeches, too. Those knives will flash out and cut you to ribbons before you can say,
"More booyah," said Baptiste. "What are you talking about?"
A savage and frightening woman, said Babiche. But he was not worried.
"She sounds like just the woman for us, my brother. Har!"
I'm getting out of here, said Orph. Take the mail sack. I'm going out to saddle up Sylvia. Poor Sylvia. I'd hoped to get her more rest, but I don't want to be here when Two Strike comes after this boy. Babiche and Baptiste spooned their stew hastily into their mouths, tossed down the bowls and spoons to be licked clean by mice, and picked up the sacks of mail.
"We'll ride out too," said Babiche, "not because we're afraid of this Two Strike, but because we have taken a blood oath pledge to deliver this precious mail."
As he bolted out the door, Orph pointed at Chickadee. And what about him?
"We'll pop him in a mail sack and take him along," said Baptiste.
Oh no, groaned Chickadee, not the mail sack again. Baptiste raised his fist. Orph Carter cried out, Do not strike him! Orph leaped onto his horse and shouted as he wheeled to gallop south. Don't you fellows know why she's got the name Two Strike? Orph kept yelling the reason, and they might have learned it too, but as he galloped away in delirious haste, his voice was cut off by the wind. I'll climb into the mail sack myself, said Chickadee, bolder now that he knew the brothers would not punch him. It would be better if you two left me here, though. That way, when Two Strike tracks me down, you won't be here. There'll be just me. I promise I will tell her that you treated me well." The two brothers looked at each other. Then Babiche shrugged. Baptiste shuffled his feet around in the snow.
"We would actually like to meet this ferocious female," said Baptiste. And the fact is, well, you tell him, Babiche." "The fact is," said Babiche with a deep, heartfelt sigh, "although it has been a short time, our affections, they grow quick. We have actually begun to like you. Once we like a person, we can never part with him. Are we?"
"We feel this way about few things," said Baptiste, stuffing Chickadee gently down into the mail sack.
"Liking leads to love. Our horses, Brownie and Brownie, we love them with all the passion in our souls. And each other, of course, we love. We do not like our father, but we will forever love our mother, the miraculous saint. The saint!"
The last sight of Chickadee saw that day was the brothers The last sight Chickadee saw that day was the brothers making the cross over their chests and kissing their fingers, just the way they did the first time they mentioned their mother. Maybe it is a sign language for mother, thought Chickadee. But the black-robed priest made that sign too. Of course, priests have mothers. I wonder if their mothers wear black robes too. With the mail sack shut, the darkness, and Babiche's woolly vest cradling him again, Chickadee became drowsy. The horses had stopped. Chickadee was gently lowered to the ground in the mail sack. Babiche let him out.
"There is trouble, my little servant friend," said Babiche. "Look."
On the winter grassy ground, still littered with bits of snow, lay Baptiste. He was moaning incoherently, clutching his stomach.
"I blame myself," said Babiche. "Last night, while you were sleeping, we took out a bottle of rot-gut whiskey. Baptiste is very sensitive. Now his gut is rotting. Terrible!"
There were tears in Babiche's eyes.
"And just as bad, Brownie and Brownie."
Chickadee noticed that the two horses were panting strangely, foaming at the mouth, and their heads were hanging low.
"There must have been some ginseng weed in their hay. It makes them go loco crazy. We must go on somehow," said Babiche. "The mail must be delivered. Can you carry the sack?"
Chickadee tried to pick it up, but he couldn't budge it.
Can you carry Baptiste?"
Chickadee tried to pick up Baptiste, but he couldn't even manage to hold up one of his heavy tree legs.
"Can you lead the horses?"
Chickadee took the reins. Babiche looked wildly around from his brother to the heavy mail sack and back to his brother again. He groaned as if he lay beneath a terrible weight.
"Which to choose? Do I carry my brother? Do I carry the mail? Even with my vast strength, I cannot carry both."
The horses seemed drunk, rolling their eyes, neighing sadly and softly, and spat up green saliva.
"Please tell me what to do, little servant friend," said Babiche. "Do I carry the mail which my blood oath compels me to deliver? Or do I carry my brother, whom I love beyond all things except my sainted mother, the horses, and now perhaps you?"
Babiche crossed his chest and kissed his fingers with tragic desperation.
"What would you do?"
Babiche asked, his eyes filling with tears. "I would carry my brother first, then lay him down and go back for the mail. Then repeat over and over until you get there. Meanwhile, I would send my servant back to the barn with the sick horses."
"Not only are you a master cook," said Babiche, "but you are wise. We will follow your plan."
So, Babiche hoisted his heavy brother onto his back and staggered forward, leaving the mail in its sack on the ground. Chickadee tugged the reins, and the addled horses followed him.
"Au revoir,"
called Babiche. "Gigawabamin," cried Chickadee. They began to walk in opposite directions. Chapter 11. Riverbank. Omakayas woke in silence and poked her head out of the pack of furs. The wind and snow had stopped. It was near dawn, the stars were out, and the air was warm. Omakayas took a pinch of tobacco from the pouch at her waist and put it on the ground. "Miigwech," she said to the southern thunderbirds. A southern wind had blown the snow away. There was the scent of spring in the air. The family huddled together, relieved. In her heart, Omakaya said a desperate prayer, begging the Creator to keep Chickadee safe. From a low bush nearby, She heard the soft call of a chickadee, and she smiled in hope. Omakayas and Nokomis built a fire to boil some tea and warm their stomachs. They ate some dried meat flavored with maple sugar. Before dawn, they hitched up their dogs and started walking. They went toward the Red River, for when they reached it, they would follow it north toward Pembina. But in the blizzard, they had lost their trail. Miigwam, Two Strike, and Anamikins woke in their cave of snow to the sound of dripping water. They had hollowed out their snow cave in the roots of a great tree on the banks of the Red River. It was a cave that led farther back into the earth, but the back wall was a heavy mat of dirt, leaves, and sticks. As the three of them oriented themselves to the light, there was suddenly a great cracking crash behind them. With a gust of odorous steam, a huge bear scrambled and squeezed by them. The bear liberated itself so suddenly from its den and was so surprised by its visitors that in a moment it was gone, and the three humans were blinking their eyes and rearranging themselves. Two Strike was out of the entrance in a flash, but instead of following the bear, she stood rooted to the riverbank. Before them, they could see the ice was starting to break up. From the den deep in snow, earth, and roots, they hadn't realized the ice had already begun to jam and melt. Already the river was too dangerous to cross. There was no trail for them to follow. They would have to meet the others in Pembina. "Nevertheless, we will find that boy," Two Strikes said to the river. She hit Anamikins across the shoulders. It was her way of comforting him. Anamikins scrambled to the top of the bank. His face was still. He scanned the horizon to all sides, then he reached into his pouch and put a pinch of tobacco on the ground. He prayed to the spirits, the Arizo Kaanag. "Please help us find Chickadee." Chapter 12. Chickadee made his way along the tips of melting snowdrifts and the edges of mush sloughs. As he walked along, he argued with himself. "Am I the servant of Babiche and Baptiste, or am I their little friend? Babiche gave me the horses to bring back safely to their barn. However, I was stolen. I am lonesome. I want to go home." Chickadee turned around and asked Brownie and Brownie, "Must I be loyal to the brothers who stole me?" The horses pawed the ground and drooled. They gave Chickadee unfocused, dreamy stares, then bent their heads down and ate some winter grass sticking up out of the snow. Chickadee let them eat. The grass was probably good medicine for them. No, Chickadee decided. He tugged the horses along, and as he walked, he spoke out loud. "My mother cries for me. My brother is lonely for me. My sister Zosie sighs. My father holds my mother's hands in his and prays for my return. My Nokomis wipes her old eyes." Imagining all the grief his family felt put him in a desperate mood, and tears of frustration filled his eyes. He stopped in the trackless, featureless, sky-filled, and windy world. "I must go to them," he said. "The only way I know to get to them is to find the river and then follow it north." Once he had made a decision, Chickadee felt better. He began to trudge along in the direction of the river. The horses, sensing that he had a destination in mind, seemed to regain their senses. They followed with an eager gait and stopped spitting foam. Chickadee didn't have to coax them along. They walked for several hours. Chickadee got hungry, then hungrier, and at last so hungry that he longed for the bottom of that pot of booyah. He imagined the stick he'd used to scrape the crud on the bottom into his mouth. "If only there was something to eat," he said to the horses. But there wasn't anything to eat. Just streaks of old snow and winter grass sticking up in tufts or crushed down in soft packs. A rabbit might be good, but he had no jackpine root or any sort of twine to snare one. When he got to the river, perhaps he could catch a fish, if he could make a fish trap. There was a small flint and a striker in the pouch at his waist. The river seemed his best bet. But would he ever reach it? Or would he starve first, he wondered. Suddenly, there it was. But it wasn't the frozen bridge it had been when the brothers had crossed in the night. It was swollen, gray, swift, and lethally cold. The ice had gone out, shattering trees in its violent passage and making the river impassable all along its route. For a long time, Chickadee stood with the horses. He watched the roiling gray water as it churned frozen slabs of ice along in its rapid flow. They lowered their heads and munched grass. Chickadee put a few pieces of grass in his mouth just for the taste. Discouraged, Chickadee walked along the banks, then away from the river. It was rising so fast he was afraid that he and the brownies could be swept in. As he walked, Chickadee moved slower and slower. He was weak and tired. He turned to Brownie and Brownie. "You're going to have to give me a ride. First you, Brownie, and then you, Brownie. One after the other. I am too weak to keep on walking." With his last bit of strength, Chickadee climbed on top of one of the brownies. He tied the reins of the older brownie to his saddle, then leaned forward, tangled his fists in the horse's mane, and lay his head down on its neck. Chickadee didn't sleep. It was just very weak. He tried to steer Brownie toward the river, but of course, when a horse is left to its own devices, it will go back to the safety of its barn. So late that day, in spite of his decision to escape the brothers, Chickadee found himself back at their cabin. "Oh, yay!" He was disappointed, but he slipped off Brownie and took off both horses' saddles. The brothers had roughly fenced in an area beside the shanty of a barn. There was enough old grass for the horses to browse. The horses nickered and snorted. They pawed up clumps of grass from the snow. They seemed happy enough. "Now for me," said Chickadee. "Let's see what the mice have left." He went into the stinking cabin and began to rummage around among the tins and sacks where the brothers kept their food. Everything was gone, it seemed, cleaned right out. There was only a bit of flour in the bottom of a sack. Even the mice were gone. They were finding more food outside of the cabin now than inside. Chickadee continued looking. Finally, at the bottom of a metal box, he found two things, a striker and fire steel, which might come in handy, so he put them in the pouch that hung from his belt. He found a ball of twine, handy also, and a tiny ball of pemmican, a mixture of pounded meat, berries, and fat. "Food!" He shouted with joy. It was surely old and slightly rancid, but he went outside and ate it, leaning against the pole walls in the fading sun. He listened to the wind boom around him and drank from a bowl of melted snow. He ate slowly, appreciating every stale nibble. It wasn't much, but his stomach stopped aching and his body grew warm in the sunshine and comfortable. To the north, a small speck appeared on the horizon. He watched as it enlarged, wavering, and slowly came into focus. The thing was a wagon drawn by an ox cart. There was a driver up front, dressed in black robes, a priest. In back, there were a number of huge gray creatures that resembled birds. Chickadee had heard that the white people had some animals the Anishinaabe had never seen before. He had seen a pig, a gokush. He had never seen the bakakwen, the chicken. He had heard that they had an animal with a long gray snout with feet like boulders and enormous ear flaps. He had heard of the long-necked one, spotted, that could see over the tops of trees. His grandfather had once been to a city and had seen those animals in iron houses like big traps. Could this be one of the new animals? Chickadee moved cautiously around the side of the house and decided not to give himself away. The only place he could find to hide was a stack of slough grass, so he climbed to the top and lifted up a heavy mat of hay and slipped underneath. He had placed himself exactly where he could see all that went on when the wagon pulled into the yard. Peeping out from under the hay, Chickadee saw immediately that he had been wrong about the creatures. The gray wings were pieces of cloth, long, stiff veils. They surrounded the faces of 6 white women, who also wore long cloaks of gray. Their hands were encased in gray mittens, and their feet were dainty in black lace-up boots. When the wagon stopped, they hopped down from the back. There was a small black dog with them, a serious-looking dog who jumped down to scout the area as if to make sure it was safe. At once he barked at Brownie and trotted back and forth between the women and the horses as if to make sure they knew there was danger near. Chattering like squirrels, the women in strange gray dresses went to investigate the cabin. Each ventured in and came out quickly, waving the air away from her nose. The black robe, who wore a flat black hat and had a rosy face and twinkling blue eyes, laughed. "We'd best be on our way," he said. "Come along, sisters." So thought Chickadee. These were the black-robed 6 sisters. This was a family, an odd family, who dressed much differently than most, but probably harmless. Still, he decided to remain hidden. And if not for that little black dog, he probably would have gone unnoticed. The black dog started barking. Worse, it threw itself against the haystack. Chickadee could feel the vibrations every time it smacked into the hay below. The little dog was determined to tell its family if there was something in the haystack. Some animal, they thought. "Gertrude probably smells a rat," said one of the sisters. "Come, Gertrude. Here, Gertrude." But the dog barked even more urgently, threw itself madly, insistently, until it caused the hay to tremble and slide. Chickadee had to adjust his weight.
"I saw something move," said the priest. "If it was a rat, it was enormous."
"Come, Gertrude." The sisters called the dog to them in alarm. They did not want to see an enormous rat and wanted to leave the stinking cabin in the haystack well behind them. All of the sisters, that is, except the youngest and most curious one. She was small, and a brown curl the same color as the brownie's coat peeked underneath the gray contraption on her head. "I'll get Gertrude and find out what she's so excited about. I'm not afraid of a rat, no matter how big. Sister Serafika, please." But Serafika picked her way through the muddy snow and the straw of the Gigog brothers' yard until she reached the dog. "Gertrude, what is it?" she said in her gentle voice. The dog went wild, hopping high and smashing its little body against the hay. Serafika laughed and stood on tiptoe. She peered up into the stack of grass and looked straight into Chickadee's eyes. "It's not a rat," she called. It's a boy, I think." The priest came running. "Look, Father," she pointed. Chickadee tried to sink into the hay, but he had hunkered down as far as he could.
"I can't see anything," said the priest.
"If it is a boy, then he is hungry," said Serafika. Her face was round and sweet. She had green eyes with long black eyelashes and a small round nose. Her mouth was generous, and her smile was wide and full. She rummaged in a bag tied to her waist and took out a piece of bread. She held the bread out in the tips of her fingers. It was fragrant, fresh, and before Chickadee could stop himself, his hand darted out from beneath the grass and snatched the roll from her hand. "There," said Serafika. "See?" The other sisters leaned over the edge of the wagon. Even from there, they could hear the munching and smacking of Chickadee enjoying the bread. He spat out a strand of grass. The priest smiled.
"Let's try to coax him out."
The priest and the sisters hadn't much to eat themselves, but each contributed a morsel. Serafika held each bit out, an offering, and every time Chickadee smelled what she held, he reached out and grabbed it. He meant to stay hidden, but his hunger was just too much for him. "Will you come out now?" asked Serafika. She held out her open hand. Chickadee tried to burrow farther down, but he knew it was no use. "Come on, we won't hurt you," she said. Of course, as she spoke English, Chickadee could not understand all of what she said, but the tone of her voice was so smooth and sweet, he knew that she meant no harm. He peeped his head out. "Ah!" cried the sisters. "He's a terrible mess," said Serafika. "Neglected. So sad." "Can we take him with us?" Yes, let's." "He is such a nice-looking boy under all that dirt." The priest put his hands out too.
"Come along," he said. "We have a place prepared for you.
You'll be fed, warm, happy." The sisters called melodiously, and the priest was so pink and jolly that Chickadee found himself sliding from the slough grass into their arms. Serafika brought him into the wagon, and the sisters laughed and held their noses, but climbed in and made a place for him in the straw with the little black dog. The dog had the sort of mouth that curls up in a cheerful smile. He seemed to grin as Chickadee settled in beside him. How could a boy resist what seemed to be a happy family? From the few words he understood, they called the priest father, and there was a woman in the wagon, worn and stern, whom they called Mother. "Mother," said Serafika, "wasn't it a blessing that we found this boy? He might have starved to death, this poor orphan."
"Orphan my foot," said Mother. "He is a filthy savage." "Mother, you shouldn't say that," said the jolly priest. "Don't you dare tell me what to say," said Mother. "He could kill us all in our sleep."
"He's just a little boy," said Serafika.
"Just you keep an eye on him," said Mother.
She fixed a cold gray eye on Chickadee and held him in her glare. As Chickadee bounced along on the straw bedding with the dog, the 6 sisters, the mother, and the father, he didn't know if he was leaving his family behind or if through this new adventure he might be brought closer to them. He only knew that to stay behind was impossible. He would certainly have starved before the 2 brothers returned, and once they did return, he would once again have been their servant. Wherever he ended up, he hoped he'd find an Anishinaabe who could bring word back to his parents. As the wagon went on and on, roughly following the path of the river, he tried talking to the nice sister, the one who pointed to herself and said Serafika. Chickadee pointed to himself and said the word for Chickadee in Ojibwe, which is Giji Giji Ganeshin. No matter how hard Serafika tried, her tongue got tangled up when she repeated the word. But once, when the wagon stopped and the sisters got out to eat their tiny scraps of food and to pray, a small bird landed in the bushes near the wagon. Chickadee looked at the bird for a long time, and it looked back at him. "Stay with me," he said to his namesake. The bird seemed to understand. Chickadee took Serafika's sleeve and pointed to himself, to the bird, and back again. She understood. "Your name means Chickadee." Excited, she told the other women, who smiled at him, and told Serafika that the name was perfect for such a thin and lively little boy. Only the one called Mother frowned and gave Serafika a sour look. "He'll be baptized and given a proper name," she said. "A saint's name. How typically pagan, to be named after a bird." For 2 days, the little wagon load of women traveled. At night, they all slept, curled in the straw. During the day, Chickadee saw them secretly wincing whenever the wagon jounced over a big rock. He had the soft straw to sit on while they were arranged across 2 hard-board benches. At last, they reached a crossing. At the crossing, there was a ferry boat that ran along underneath a huge cable. The river was much calmer here, though still icy and gray and flowing fast. It would be possible to cross. The priest and the ferry owner coaxed the ox aboard and secured the wagon. Then the sisters stood in a bunch and held tight to the sides of the barge. Serafika held on to Chickadee, and the dog crouched near his feet. If the ferry were to sway out into the river, if the cables were to snap, they would swing out into the treacherous current for a wild and deadly ride. The sisters prayed fervently with their eyes closed, all except for Serafika. Her eyes were open and her lips moved. It looked like to Chickadee that she enjoyed the ride. When at last the party was on the other side of the river, Chickadee's first thought was that now he could escape and follow the river north. It would lead him back home eventually, although he was farther away than he'd ever been. For a while the wagon followed the river north. Then suddenly a rutted trail appeared and it veered east. Chickadee watched each small landmark carefully. He was elated to again see trees, then sloughs, then rolling hills and land that looked like home, even though much of it was torn up. Now he saw small board houses painted white or even red. He'd only seen a trader's house painted this way before. Fluffy white and rust-colored birds ran around these houses. From his mother's description, he knew that these were chickens. They'd entered farm country, settled by tall people with pale eyes and sun-bright hair. At last, after the endless journey, the wagon stopped outside a log cabin with a cross fixed over the door. There were 2 other log cabins beside the first one, and a barn behind. One of the smaller cabins belonged to all of the sisters and the mother. The father had the other cabin, which was divided into a small room for him and a larger room with several small tables in it. In the front of the room, there was a small piece of wood as black as river rock. Father took a white stick in his hands and traced marks on the blackness. Then, with his other hand, he erased them and made other marks. "Chalkboard," said Father. He gave the white stick to Chickadee. He imitated the marks that Father had made, and Father laughed. "I believe you'll have no trouble learning the alphabet," he said. "This is a school. Can you say school?" Chickadee looked at him quizzically. "Oh well, it doesn't matter. You'll learn soon enough. For now, you can sleep here in the corner." He showed Chickadee a tiny area where several blankets were piled. "The other students will come in a few days," said Father, patting Chickadee's head. He tugged one of Chickadee's braids and said, "Don't worry, Mother Anthony will cut these off for you." Chickadee had no idea what the priest had just said, but before he went to sleep, he looked all around the room. On the desk in an open box, he saw a small knife. Chickadee had been taught never, ever to steal, but he broke this rule. Something about the strange family made him uneasy. He did not trust the mother. He took the knife. And that brings us to an end of chapter 12. Thanks for listening in. I'll look forward to following up with you on our Google Classroom. I hope a few of you managed to do the Kahoot this week, and I will look at that and we'll post some study questions and a little form for you to fill out later this weekend. Thanks. Have a good day.